First of all, I guess I will start by saying that I've been teaching at the Annual Yemei Iyun for longer than I can count, and every year is awesome. So I'm really happy to be here, even in this new location, this new old location for me, as it were. And being in Ramat Arab brings back a lot of memories from my single days when I was learning at Trisha. So it's really nice to be here in a new way. All right, the topic. So by way of introduction, and I'm dating myself a little bit, but when I was learning at Trisha full time, I was kind of obsessed with the Moshe-Aharon relationship. Really wanted to understand, as I have a sister who's close in age to me. I'm not mapping us onto that relationship in any way. She's my older sister, but I just wondered how that all went down. The Aharon becoming the helper and sort of seeming to be okay with it, and then them having their own roles that they worked side by side at times. Who did that makkah? Read closely, not even clear who was doing what. And I tried to trace their relationship and the fault lines in their relationship, starting in the book of Shemot and going all the way through. I never finished that project, but it has lingered with me for a long time. Okay, that's intro number one. Intro number two, and I guess Hannah knows this most intimately, but I'm currently working on the book of Vayikra for parents learning with kids. And I have lots of different strategies that I've been trying to employ to make Vayikra come alive, as it were, without making it something that it isn't. So one of the strategies is to, and I borrow from the Midrash, which is to upplay the suppressed narrative within the legal material. And I have found this, of course, not on my own. This is through the Midrashic tradition. And so part of my job in the book, as I see it, is to find the nuggets of Midrashim that are most useful and have a message for kids that brings out really not something that doesn't belong in the Psukim. It's there. You just don't see it unless you look for it. Along the way, as I've been looking for that suppressed narrative, I kept finding myself looking at these midrashim about Aharon, and Aaron in particular, and his role in the Chet HaEgel. So this shiur is really a collection. It could have been many others. I just put here 3 that are engaging with this question. I think we will find ourselves thinking also about the Moshe-Aharon relationship. We will also find ourselves thinking about the Aharon-God relationship, and the people are in there too. Usually it's a neat triangle, but I think we need a square, because there's God, Moshe, Aharon, and the people that are all on the table today, as it were. And the third introduction, if you are a fan of Aviva Zornberg, okay, we got some hands up. So this is her newest book that came out in the spring. It's wonderful, and as all her books are, takes time to really read through and understand. I will recommend something I've been doing with this book, which is I have a chavruta with a friend, and we read the book, like we read a chapter, and then we convene and we... Sure, I'll send you my Zoom link. But it's a really good way of processing, because you read a chapter, you get what you get, but then when you talk about it, you realize there's so much more. Right, always is. And Aviva in this book, among other things, I guess her main thesis, and she lays this out in the introduction, is that all of Sefer Vayikra is a response to Chet HaEgel. And that Chet HaEgel, so if you're already reading the book, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the you will see one of the midrashim is a midrash that she specifically talks about in the chapter 1. But she brings out what is already in the midrash, this idea that Chet HaEgel was never really resolved. And that the Mishkan is a direct response, both in the way that it was built and the way that it was run, and the roles of all of the different members with the Mishkan. They're all designed to create a kind of kapara and a kind of tikkun for what happens in Chet HaEgel. So that's really interesting, and that's in the introduction. She talks about the 2 different traditions, about the chronology, both of which, in a way, work out for her theory. So you'll see. Take a look, and you'll join our chavrusa. Okay. So today I want to focus specifically on the question of Aharon and Aharon's role, not so much in Chet HaEgel, although we will start there, but more thinking about the afterlife of Chet HaEgel for Aharon. And before we do that, I want to just say one more thing, which is recently, a couple of years ago, I was teaching a lot of Parsha on Bamidbar, and one of the issues that kept coming up for me there was the role of the Leviim and the Leviim as having been really the murderers in Chet HaEgel, who suddenly became, or not suddenly, but gradually became the facilitators of atonement and the facilitators of closeness between the Jewish people and God. And I kept looking at, again, Midrashic material that directly addressed this was not necessarily an easy thing for the people to accept. So putting that out there, Aharon, his involvement in Chet HaEgel becomes Aharon HaKohen, the Leviim and their role in, killing each other,
And teachers.
Right? And teachers, but their public role after what they did, right, is not simple. So we're putting that all out there. Okay, let's start by opening up in our Tanakh to Shemot Lamed Bet. I always try to find a mnemonic for the perek so that I don't forget where things are. And Shemot Lamed Bet it's in the lave of Sefer Shemot. Right? That's where the story of Chet HaEgel resides. You might say the lave is Matan Torah, but certainly, you have a different book than me. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of jumping around. Couple of psukim. We all know the story, but it is one of those stories that each time you read it, you find something puzzling anew. Actually, since I just forgot your name. John. Okay. What does your eye normally draw itself to when you read the story of Chet HaEgel?
The topography and the distances, right? Like the people are down there, they don't know what's happening. Moshe's hidden by a cloud, and suddenly he sees what happens. Then Yehoshua is sort of in the middle. And how that all kind of collapses on itself.
Beautiful. Okay, it's almost like if you were to have, I mostly teach teenagers, if you were to have a group of people acting this out, you would need like a very big space to try to map out what was going on. The people very far removed, and the word ra'ah is clearly a milah mancha in this story. Who's seeing what and who's not seeing what, and what seeing means shows up all the time. But you're right, if we want to capture the kind of divide, we have to look earlier, which we're not going to, but to see Moshe up above, happy as a clam with God, and they're doing their thing, but then down below this thing is happening. Okay. What else? What do you, when you think of Chet HaEgel? Alice, no, we won't call on you. Okay. I will tell you what I normally am very focused on, and some of you maybe have studied this with me before, is the question of the role of the women in the story, which is also only in the level of Midrash, but it's tucked between, right, Aharon's command to bring the jewelry and then the people who show up, which seem to be different people, right? And that the Midrashic narrative brings out this idea of the women who were not willing really to donate their jewelry because the jewelry represented their connection with God and all the miracles that they had seen, right? And they said, heck no, we're not giving those up, right? We after what we've seen, and then the men give their own jewelry. Right? That's usually what I focus on. But for today, I really want to look at Aharon and what Aharon does and doesn't do in the story. So if we start with Pasuk Aleph in Lamed Bet. Vayar ha'am, and there's that word, ki boshesh Moshe lared min ha'har, vayikahel ha'am al Aharon, vayomru elav, kuma seilanu Elohim, asher yelchu lefanenu, ki ze Moshe ha'ish, asher ha'elanu me'eretz Mitzrayim, lo yadanu mehayalo. Perek Lamed Bet, Pasuk Aleph. So there's the Vayar. They see or they intuit or they are afraid of what they're not seeing, which is Moshe's return. And then Vayikahel ha'am, right? So there's like a upward motion. It's aggressive, right? And they're figuratively on top of Aharon. And they say what they say. Okay, for time being, let's move on to Aharon's response. Vayomer alehem Aharon. Parkunis mehazahav asher ba'oznei nashechem b'nechem uvnotechem v'haviu elai. And then they do it and they bring it to Aharon. And then in Pasuk Daled, vayikach miyadam, vayatzer oto bacheret, vayasehu egel masecha, vayomru ele Elohecha Yisrael asher ha'elucha me'eretz Mitzrayim. So, right, there's what to say about why he tells them to get the jewelry. Classic answer. What was his plan? Delay, okay? Which of course is nowhere on the surface of the text. That is so ingrained into our understanding of the story because of Rashi, right? And that comes through the Midrash, the pipeline. It's not a bad reading because Aharon doesn't show up to the story without a personality and a role. There's no reason to be suspicious of him. He is clearly on the other side of the Am. They come to him with this request. But just to take note that, they say what they say and he says what he says. We don't get to see his motive, at least in the surface of the text. And then when he takes from their hands the jewelry and he puts it in a mold, vayatzer oto bacharetz, vayaasehu egel masecha. He does it. He makes it, right? The maaseh egel hazahav. It's the simple reading of it, right? And as we'll see very soon in the Midrash, like what you have to do when you're reading this story is read against the simple sense if you want to rescue Aharon. Right? Like the verbs are very clear. Vaya'asehu. Yeah. Right? He's the one who made it. He didn't want it. He wasn't the one who said, Kumase lanu Elohim, but Vaya'asehu. And then the pasuk, which we'll see in a moment that the Midrash is going to make a lot of use of, Vayar Aharon, pasuk hey, Vayar Aharon, Vayiven mizbeach lefanav, Vayikra Aharon, Vayomar, Chag laHashem machar. So how would you translate that? There's the Vayar again, right? He saw what?
What they were doing?
Yeah, maybe he saw what they were doing, but what were they doing actually?
They had stopped doing it because they had given him the gold.
Yeah, they weren't doing anything actually. He was doing the doing. If anything, what were they doing in the pasuk before?
They were identifying.
They were saying. So you might think that it would be Vayishma Aharon. Vayishma Aharon. Aharon heard, right? It's interesting, right? It kind of makes sense to see it as, yeah, he saw what they were doing. But if we're being very, specific and slow about it, there's not really anything for him to see about them. He definitely could see what he did. Right? So Vayar Aharon is a strange verb, let's just say. It's open to interpretation. And then after the Vayar, there's a Vayiven. So there's some kind of response there after the seeing, however you understand that. He builds the Mizbeach, again, an indicting verb. He built the Mizbeach, right? Nobody else was asking for anything at this moment, but it's indicting in terms of his action, his responsibility. And then he calls out and he says a strange thing. Chag laHashem machar. Right? Tomorrow, okay, this is here. You're already saying Elo Elohecha Yisrael. Tomorrow will be a festival for God. So what was today? Well, okay, so one way of reading it is right now you're celebrating and you're worshiping in some way El Elohecha Yisrael, which sounds like some version of God, but it's the Egel, right? So, but maybe you could, in a positive way, you could say he's reframing. Right now it looks like you're doing something around this Egel. Tomorrow Chag laHashem machar, but it's also very puzzling. Like what's going on? How so?
Well, he's saying you're doing this and we'll continue it tomorrow.
Oh, there's no reason to read it as a reframe.
No.
Right? Why? Okay. Whatever it is that you're doing now is acceptable and we will continue it.
We didn't have a whole history or inclination to reinterpret and say, Aaron wouldn't do that. But just the plain language, it sounds like he's endorsing it.
Okay. The Yud K Vav K part in there is still strange because nobody has said anything about this being a celebration of God. So that part is new. They said Elohecha Yisrael.
And he says another word.
And he uses maybe, but it's subtle. But it's subtle. Okay. All right. And then they get up in the morning, Vaya'alu olot, Vayagishu shlamim, and then they're happy. They're eating, they're drinking, they're engaged, they're fully engaged in what Aviva's going to call this, they're fully invested in this God in our midst. This kind of they have what they need. Okay, now, what happens? The next scene is up in the mountain, back in that geographical distance, when Hashem speaks to Moshe and tells him what's going on. Just from your memory, what does he tell them? What does he tell them? Tell Moshe. Sorry. What does God tell Moshe? Yeah, go see your people. There's all that your people thing going on. Right, exactly. Your son is, exactly. And what about Aharon? So I didn't really notice it until I was preparing for this year, but there's no mention of Aharon's role, right? So min hastam, when God responds and directs Moshe to go down, he makes no mention of Aharon's role. That doesn't seem to be the focus. The focus is in the people's rebellion, right? And that in and of itself is very interesting to note, that however we understand or don't understand Aharon's role, from the divine perspective, he's not part of the main equation here. But when Moshe goes down from the mountain, right, what's the first thing that happens? Take a look at, let's say, starting in Pasuk Yud Tet. Vayikra asher karev el hamachane vayar et ha'egel umecholot vayichar af Moshe vayashlech miyadav et haluchot vayishaber otam tachat ahar. Right, so he gets very angry when he sees what he sees, and he immediately just throws the luchot. He destroys them, and the next pasuk takes the egel, burns it, grinds it, right, and then feeds the people with a mixture of the egel and the water. That's pasuk. I'm sorry, moving quickly. Pasuk Chaf. So Moshe's first, he's like in action mode, right? Right away, he needs to get rid of that as soon as possible, and he needs to make really clear that what they've done is totally out of bounds. And then comes this conversation with Aharon. Okay, so starting in Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Vayomer Moshe el Aharon, me'asa lecha ha'am hazeh, ki haveta alav chata'a gdolah. I find that to be a really fascinating question. The opening is very generous. Me'asa lecha ha'am hazeh. What have they done to you, this nation? You have something you want to say? 1 second, Diane. But then the second part is ki haveta alav chata'a gdolah, because you have brought upon them this very egregious sin. So it's this and this, right? He doesn't come out, there's no vayichar af, there's no anger direct, there's no verb of anger directed at Aharon. There is an open question embedded in an accusation.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like he left him to babysit and the house burned down.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And you imagine Aharon, however he understood what he was doing, right? And let's assume the most generous read of him, he's caught red-handed. Right? He literally, his brother comes down and it's all the evidence, it's right there. Okay? So he asks him this question, and then how does he answer? Al yichar af adoni. So despite the verb, he understood. There was a lot of anger. Please don't be angry with me. Atayadata et ha'am ki berahu. It's on them, totally on them. He's right. And then he tells him verbatim what happened. Vayomru li aselanu Elohim asher yechul lefanenu ki ze Moshe ha'ish. He doesn't leave that part out. Asher ha'elanu me'eretz Mitzrayim lo yadanu mehayalo. Va'omar lahem lemi hazahav hitparku vayitnu li v'ashlichehu ba'ish vayetze ha'egel hazeh. Okay. And finally, 2 more psukim I want to bring into our discussion. Vayar Moshe, there's that verb again, the next one. Vayar Moshe et ha'am ki paruahu ki pera'o Aharon l'shimtza bekamehem. So he sees them, they're wild, but it's Aharon who made them that way.
Aharon acts like the egel came on its own.
Correct. That's a really important shift. Vayasehu, but vayete ha'egel. Right, and there are midrashim that actually talk about how that is what happened, but take note that that's not the verb that was used in the beginning.
Yeah, that's so far-fetched. It's like when a little kid, you caught a little kid doing something outlandish, and it's not on that level. How can you expect anybody to believe that?
Okay, well, we're reading. I'm sort of leading you down a very not generous read, right? But because I want to expose all the places where it's kind of complicated. But again, Frida, like when you think about, and we'll see in a minute when the Midrash talks about what else was going on at that scene, right? And his hands, behind his back, and the threat of his own death, and the undoing, all those things, right? It kind of looks a little different what he did, but still. Okay, and just one more pasuk. Take a look at pasuk Lamed Hey, same perek at the very end. Vayigov Hashem et ha'am al asher asu et ha'egel asher asa Aharon. So there he is again. It's the people who made the egel, but it's Aharon who did it. So my question is, and we'll start taking a look at the Midrashim. The question is, if you think about post Chet HaEgel, Like after this perek, right? What happens? What's the major drama? It's Moshe requesting forgiveness for the people, right? And that's what we say all the time in our liturgy. The Aharon piece, like, gets dropped. This conversation between Moshe and Aharon is as close as we get to a rapprochement and a discussion. And to me, the adjective that pops into my head is it's hasty. It's hasty. It's just right what's happening at that moment. And we all know from parenting and relationships and whatever, the real work doesn't happen in the moment of the exposure. It's like 3 days later or 6 months later or whenever you can really talk about the backstory. So it never happens between Moshe and Aharon in any explicit way. The only other time that we see a very difficult conversation between them is right after Nadav and Abihu die, a very complicated conversation, which to me, and I'm assuming I haven't read that chapter yet, but to Aviva, there's valence of the backdrop, the unresolved backdrop, the trauma, and there is no rapprochement between God and Aharon. There is no conversation between God and Aharon about Chet HaEgel at all.
His response seems to be silence and action. He doesn't talk Aharon much. He's not a talker. I mean,
you're thinking Vayidom Aharon, right? That's right. So that's not his whole life, but you're right. We don't see.
But when he's faced with a breach with him and God, that when he feels disapproved of or punished, he's silent.
What else are you thinking of? What other stories are relevant?
Maybe I'm not thinking of any other story, but
Right. No, if you think about, and back to my Drisha project, the Moshe and Aharon of Shemot, we don't see Aharon talking a lot. You're right.
Well, he's supposed to.
He's the talker. Yeah, he's the talker, but we don't see him.
Of him as silent. I mean,
right?
That's just
the sidekick. You see him as the sidekick, right?
He's a man. He does things. He builds. He does korbanot. He's very hands-on, but he doesn't. It's not about words.
Okay.
He's the middleman.
He's the middleman. Right.
He's always the middleman.
So here's the thing, right? And here's the theory, certainly that Aviva is espousing, and that I'm I'm actually very tempted to see it too, that there is no direct conversation between God and Aharon post Chet HaEgel, but him becoming Kohen Gadol. Maybe she doesn't say this is what I think, but him becoming Kohen Gadol and having that sort of public role in front of the people and the role of the Mitaken and the Mechaper, that is the response. That is the response. And all of what Aharon does, it's not a censuring. Lehefech. Okay, either, as we'll see in one midrash, it's a kind of direct response to what happened, or it's a means for him to work through what happened.
Whose response is it?
God's response. God's response. Okay, go ahead, Diane.
The prelude to this entire sequence is that the first tablets are destroyed by Moshe.
Mm-hmm.
So the relationship between Moshe as the representative of the people of God is destroyed before all of this. Moshe deals with this.
Mm.
And maybe before the second one, the set of tablets are made, that has to be dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yes. Okay, let's start. That was all intro. Let's start. So if you look on your sheet, everybody has a sheet. There are 3 sources. This is what I call a very ambitious source sheet. I know it's only 3, but there's a lot on here. And I really want to make sure that we do the first one. If we get to the other 2, it'll be great. So the opening midrash here, it's from Vayikra Rabbah Yud Gimel. Are people familiar with the Petichta? I'm so happy you said yes, Hannah. Or it'd be a problem, but okay. So there's a particular form of midrash that shows up in lots of the rabbas. So Eicha Rabbah, Vayikra Rabbah, Breishi Rabbah. Usually, Rabbi so-and-so patach, and then what will come is a pasuk from somewhere in Tanakh, far afield from, let's say in our example, Vayikra. That pasuk was quoted, and then the pasuk is interpreted several times until eventually the midrash arrives at the pasuk that you were hoping to see an interpretation about. And I, this is not me. This is what scholars understand, that the Petichta is probably an example of what ancient rabbis would do when they would travel and give sermons. Begin with a hook. Our rabbis do that too. They start with a joke, something from NPR, something from sports, and that brings in the interest, and then through that are able to weave it to the parsha. The ancient way of doing this was psukim. And an added bonus was then teaching people lots of psukim that come from otherwise sfarim that don't have a place in the liturgical cycle. So very often the psukim which are quoted are from Iyov, from Mishlei, Tehillim. Tehillim does have a place, but sort of wide open psukim that can be interpreted in lots of ways. So I accidentally did not include the pasuk of the Petichta in here because we came in the middle. But if you're interested in looking, it's in Tehillim. I didn't write down the reference, my bad. Okay, I'll read you what it says and then we can find it later. Ahavta tzedek vatisna resha al kain meshochacha elokim elokecha shemen sason mechaverecha. I think the last part is a song. Sason mechaverecha. I don't know, I have that in my head. Okay, ahavta tzedek vatisna resha means you love justice and you hated wickedness, and because of that, God anointed you with the oil of joy over your chaverim. Yeah, if you look up and you can get the source, the beginning has that pasuk. So the Petichta takes this pasuk, this very open pasuk, who's it talking about? Lots of people in the Torah loved justice and hated wickedness, and then were sort of given a role above their friends. The first way the Midrash interprets that is in terms of Avraham Avinu. And what would be the place that you, if you were writing this Petichta, where would you draw from in Abraham's life? Of Ahavta Tzedek Vatisna Resha? Sodom and Amorah. Okay, the second way the Midrash interprets it is through Yeshayahu. And that's a little bit, it's not relating to a particular moment in his life, but the fact that he was willing to be the Navi, when they were at that point really entrenched in their wicked ways, and he still was trying to help them. And then the third way is Aharon.
So
go ahead.
It's just for people's reference, it's Tehillim Memhei Pasuk Chet.
Thank you. Tehillim Memhei Pasuk Chet. Okay.
Memhei Pasuk Chet.
Okay. So we're coming in the part which is talking about Aharon. So let's look at the top, despite the green. The green's the really important part. That leads us to Vayikra. But let's read the other part since we're familiar with these Midrashim and it's good to see them inside. Rabbi Barachia b'Shem Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana patar kraya ba'Aharon. Okay, so he, unlike the others, applies this pasuk to Aharon. When was he somebody who was a lover of justice and a hater of wickedness? B'sha'a she'asu Yisrael oto ma'aseh. Right? That also, by the way, supports Aviva's theory. It's like, you just need to say oto ma'aseh. It's so formative, right? That everything is a response to and revolving around that primary trauma. Okay? Batchila halchu etzel chur. Who's chur?
The nephew.
Miriam.
He got killed.
Okay, so here's a version of that Midrash, because Hur and Aharon were, when Moshe went up the mountain, he said, I'm going, but Aharon and Hur are here for you. If there's an issue, come to them. And then Hur is nowhere in Perek Lamed Bet. So the Midrash is coming to respond to that problem. Where'd he go? Batchila halchu etzel Hur, amru lo, kumase lanu Elohim, kivan shelo shama lahem, amdu alav v'haraguhu. Hadahu dichtiv gam bichnafayich nimtzeu dam v'gomer v'zehu damo shel chur lo b'machteret mitzatim ki al kol eila al asher asu eila Elohecha Yisrael. Okay, there's lots of proof text in there. It's worth looking them up. It's really interesting, but it's graphic, right? The Midrash is really saying it's not just that they killed Hur. It's like his blood was everywhere. This was the scene. This was the scene that Aharon stepped into. Okay, and what did he do, by the way? What did Hur do? Lo shama lahem. Doesn't even say that he, he didn't have a plan. He didn't try to persuade them. He just ignored them, and they killed him. V'yachar kach halchu etzel Aharon amru lo kumase lanu Elohim kevan sheshama Aharon kain miyad nityarei hadahu dichtiv vayar Aharon. What's the wordplay?
That it's like fear, but then it's like that he saw.
Exactly. The Vayar becomes Vayira. right? So remember that word that we noticed that was sort of a dangling verb with no direct object. What did he see? The Midrash says, reread that. Vayikra Aharon, Vayiven Mizbeach lefanav also needs to be reread. Nityare mehazavuach lefanav. The Mizbeach in this reading is not what he built, it's Chur. Chur was the zavuach. He had been slaughtered. So he was afraid from what was in front of him, and that's why he responded the way he responded. Okay, very creative, very creative.
His life? Is that
He was trying to save his life, yes. Amar Aharon, ma'aseh, harei hargu et Chur shahaya navi. Achshav im horgim oti sha'ani kohen mitkayem aleim hamikra shekatuv im yehareg b'mikdash Hashem kohen v'navi umiyad heim golim. Okay, this is a fantastic midrash. Like you said, he was afraid for his life, Fran, but then the midrash takes it like a quantum leap forward, that Aharon is afraid for them. He's afraid that this will spell the end of the Jewish people as they know it because of a pasuk in Eicha, which describes when everything got destroyed. It's when a Navi and a Kohen were killed on the same day. So he didn't want to make that happen by falling into the same trap that Chur fell into, so he needed a plan B. It's totally selfless. It's not about his life at all, actually. It's about the destiny of the Jewish people. Okay, this is like, Frieda's like, yeah, okay. This is like really far afield, okay? But this is one of the ways that the Midrash is saying, yeah, Aharon, don't read it the way it looks.
It could work.
It could be. Okay, moving on.
It's okay.
Moving on.
Save his
Not-
life.
not the
No,
plain
that's
sense
not
of
a
it.
crazy thing to want to do. I mean,
Okay, davar acher. Actually, can we skip to, no, let's read, don't skip. Davar acher, vayar Aharon, ma ra'a, im bonim heim oto, ze mevi tzror, v'ze eben, v'nimtzeit melachtam kala bevat achat. Mitoch shani boneh oto, ani mitatzel bimlachti, v'Rabbeinu Moshe yored uma'avira la'avodah zarah. ומתוך שאני בונה אותו, אני בונה אותו בשמו של הקדוש ברוך הוא. הדהו דכתיב, ויקרא אהרון ויאמר חג להשם מחר, חג לעגל מחר אין כתיב כאן, אלא חג להשם מחר. Okay, so we noticed all these things. We noticed the delaying with the jewelry. The Midrash is now continuing the delaying theory and saying, well, maybe that's why those verbs were about him. Because he said, listen, if they build it, they're going to do it in 2 seconds. But if I build it, I can drag my feet and I can take my time and I'm continuing to stall because I'm passive, well, I guess, in the sense of like he believed Moshe was coming any minute. He had to deal with this group of people. And so he was just trying to delay until Moshe would come. And that's why he built. And that last part, that refrain that we noticed, the Midrash says, yeah, that's not an accident. He doesn't say Chag L'Egel. He says Chag L'Hashem. That's part of him taking on, more responsibility to try to make things better. Okay, but here's a really interesting one. A third davar acher. This is the one that's, am I going too quickly in the Hebrew? Totally fine. Okay. Davar acher. Vayar Aharon ma ra'a. Amar Aharon, im bonin hein oto, hasirchon nitla bahen. Mutav shi'yitaleh hasirchon bi, below be Israel. He says, what did he see? Again, it's not seeing, it's intuiting, right? He recognized that if they built it on their own, they would be held responsible for the sin. But if he built it, he would be held responsible and not the Jewish people. This fits already so perfectly with that Tehillim pasuk. He hated, he wanted justice. He was going above and beyond to try to make things good. Here comes a mashal to expand on that idea. Rabbi Abba bar Yudan b'shem Rabbi Abba. Mashal leven melachim. Oh, it came out weird. Shenitzka elibo. Are your words also on top of each other? Okay, I can't read it, but I have another version. Shenitzka elibo. He became like very, oversure of himself, and he took a saif. He took a sword to cut his father. Okay. Meaning what? A little patricide, right? He was trying to overtake his father. What happened? Amarlo padgogo. Oh, you can't read it at all. Okay, never mind. Just listen. Amarlo padgogo. What's padgogo? Yeah, his pedagogue, his tutor. The prince's, like, it's a Greek word, pedagogue. So it's right. So his personal tutor said to the prince, "Al tiyagat atzmacha, tein li v'ani chotech." Like, sweetie, don't overexert yourself holding that sword. Give it to me. I'll cut your father. Okay, what happens? Hitzitz hamelech alav, amar lo, yodea ani lehechan hayta kavanatcha. Mutav shiyitaleh sirchon b'cha v'lo bivni. Chayecha min palatin didi leit ad zaya, umatar pitori at achil. Esrim v'arba anonas at nasev. What happened? The king sees this scene of the pedagogue coming at him with a sword, and he understands, again, reading against what's right directly in front of him, that pedagogue had no intention of killing the king because he wanted to kill him. He understood that the pedagogue was coming to protect the son. And he said to him, basically, I will love you for the rest of my life. I'm indebted to you for the rest of my life. You are never leaving this place, meaning I'm always going to take care of you. I assume he also didn't have to work anymore. But he said, I will feed you. You will stay here, right? You will always be in my palatin, in my palace. What's the nimshal? Kach min palatin di li leit ad zaya, umin hamikdash lo yetze, umotar ptorai at achil, v'hanoteret min hamincha. Esrim va'arba'a anonas at nasiv, elu esrim va'arba'a matnot kuna shenitnu ala Aharon ulevanav. What happens? Aharon, of course, is the pedagogue. Bnei Yisrael are the child. God is God. God is the king. He says to Aharon, and let's think about what we saw. He sees Aharon doing what Aharon is doing. Imagine God also seeing him red-handed like Moshe did. He says, I know exactly what happened here. You were doing this to protect Bnei Yisrael. You were doing this so that it wouldn't look like they made the egel, but you made the egel. And maybe that's why, Fran, we have that active verb, right, in the first version, even though it's countered by what he says. According to this midrash, Aharon was, yes, he did it on his own, but he didn't really do it. It wasn't really him. What's the reward? This, to me, is like mind-blowing. What's the reward for Aharon? Umin hamikdash lo yetze. That's coming from Vayikra Chaf Aleph. What's going on there? Vayikra Chaf Aleph.
That's after.
That's way after.
It's the rules of the Kohen.
It's the rules of the Kohen Gadol when he is, Tamei Lamed, and who he can become Tamei Lamed to. And we're told there, Umin hamikdash lo yetze. By the way, that the not leaving the mikdash is like a common theme for the Kohanim all through Sefer Vayikra. It's also during the Miluim. It's also after Nadav and Avihu died. This kind of, let's say negatively, confinement within the mikdash, right, a restriction of their personal life, that's also what's happening. The Midrash here is presenting it as a reward, right? That Hashem is saying to Aharon, I will always care for you. You will always be close to me. You will always be in the palatin, in the palace. And those 24, right, the gifts of the kohuna, that's caregiving. That's a love feed, right? And this is a very radical reading of Cheder Egel, that Aharon emerges as the undercover, lover of God and lover of the Jewish people. The hero, right? So in this way, right, if this is all we had, right, we'll get to the end in a minute, this is really saying very clearly, yeah, Aharon is a Kohen Gadol. Aharon is having this unique relationship with God, and it's a reward for what he did, right? There's no need for atonement whatsoever. There's nothing to atone for, but it's amazing how secret it is, I think.
He took the bullet for them.
He took the bullet for them, exactly. Okay, now the Midrash ends by saying, Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'Aharon, ahavta tzedek, ahavta letzadek et banai. Right? It's not that you love justice. You were trying to make my banim, like you were justifying what they did. You were making it good. V'saneta milachayavan. You didn't want them to be held accountable. Al kain mishachacha elokim elokecha. Right? Go back to that pasuk in Tehillim. That's why I have now anointed you. Which, by the way, Aaron's not identified as Kohen Gadol before Cheder Egel. Truth. Right? He's not. He's the sidekick. He's holding down the fort, when Moshe goes up on the mountain, but he's not identified as the Kohen Gadol till afterwards. So this is there's a lot to this reading that supports what we see in the Psukim. And finally, it ends, Amar lo chayecha, I swear to you, says God, shemikol shifto shel Levi lo nivchar lekehuna gdola ela ata. And here's finally our pasuk from Vayikra, kach et Aharon ve'et banav ito. Now that pasuk, if you have your Tanakh, just flip for a minute. It's the opening of Perek Chet in Vayikra. Bless you, bless you, bless you. This is where are we?
It's in the middle of Parshat Tzav. It's right as they're about to start inaugurating the Mishkan.
Exactly. Okay. So just read with me the first few psukim. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, kach et Aharon ve'et banav ito ve'et habegadim ve'et shemen hamishcha ve'et para chatat ve'et shnei ha'elim ve'et sal hamatzot ve'et kol ha'edah hakel el petach oel moed. Vayas Moshe kasher tziva Hashem oto vatikahel ha'edah el petach oel moed. You guys find it? So our midrash, right, which began with a pasuk from Tehillim, only lands technically on the pasuk kach et Aharon, which now through the midrashic reading, the word kach is not just like schlep him, move him forward. It's actually connoting bechira, right? So the fact that Aharon is summoned and now made in a public way, the Kohen Gadol, he and his children, that's a way to reward him for his actions. But I really do think that the Midrash is also picking up on those words that I said in a very loud way, the vatikahel ha'edah and ve'et kol ha'edah hakel. This is a public display. This is the next time that Aharon is standing in front of all the people after Chet HaEgel. And that verb, of course, vatikahel, resonates with what happened at the start of Chet HaEgel. So this is another way in which, not just for Aharon, right, if he has lingering anxiety, it's also for the people, right, making it very clear and visible that he is the rightful Kohen Gadol. Yeah, go ahead.
It's like, just as in some sense, right, the end of Shemot is a sort of public recognition that you could have the Mishkan, you had atoned for, in some ways you have atoned for Chet HaEgel, because I am now giving you the opportunity to build me a Mishkan, and you did it. And now I can show you publicly that Aharon has also been, quote unquote, forgiven. Or the people may think it's forgiveness, but it could just be honoring of, now that we're at the point of it, on the 8th day, we can show you that Aharon is also.
Yes. And I love how you said that, because, let's not make too much of Aharon. There's a lot of guilt going around, right? And there's a lot of atonement and tikkun and resolution that's necessary. I'm only focusing today on Aharon, but of course the people. Their primary concern is themselves, right? And the Mishkan and the Miluim was the public enactment of atonement. Okay, I think we have time for one more, maybe two. Oh, but the Hebrew is really messed up in the second one too. Does it work when I read it and you listen and along in the English? Okay. This next source is Rashi quoting the Sifra. I kept it in Rashi because Rashi does a nice job of repackaging. But the Sifra is another Midrashic collection on the book of Vayikra. It's much earlier than Vayikra Rabbah. It's from the Tannaitic period, right? So it's often referred to as a Midrash Halacha. Vayikra Rabbah is like 5th, 6th century. Sifra is more like 3rd century. And the Sifra generally does not have a lot of stories. But in this case, as you'll see, the Midrash brings forth the story. Okay, so Vayikra Tet, let's skip there for a minute in your Tanakh. Vayikra Tet Pasuk Chaf Gimel. So this is the very end of the story of the Miluim, just butting up against the story of Nadav and Avihu, which you can forget happens on that very day, on the 8th day. So the pasuk says, Vayavo Moshe v'Aharon. Let's read one pasuk before that. Vayisa Aharon et yadav el ha'am vayevarchem, vayered me'asot hachatat v'ha'olah v'hashlamim, vayavo Moshe v'Aharon el Ol Moed, vayetzu, vayevarchu et ha'am, vayerak kvod Hashem el kol ha'am. And then the pasuk following, vatetze esh milifnei Hashem, vatochal al hamizbeach et ha'olah v'et hachalavim, vayar kol ha'am, vayaronu vayiplu al pnehem. Okay, there's a lot to say actually about these psukim, but we're going to focus just on Rashi's question, which is, what is this vayavo Moshe v'Aharon? Where are they coming from? We just had, Aharon right in front with his hands outstretched, blessing the people, and then they come to the Olam Moed, and then they leave again, and then they bless them again. What's going on? The choreography, back to the acting it out. This is confusing. I don't know where people are supposed to be and why. Okay, take a look at the Davar Acher, where the highlight is. Oh, well, in the English. Davar Acher. Kevan shira'a Aharon shekarvu kol hakorbanot v'na'asu kol hama'asim v'lo yarda shchina liYisrael haya mitzta'er ve'omer yodea ani sheka'as hakadosh baruch hu alai ubishvili lo yarda shchina liYisrael. Amar lo lemoshe, Moshe achi, kach asita li shenichnasti v'nitbayashti, miyad nichnas Moshe imo ubikshu rachamim v'yarda shchina liYisrael. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.
So we just decided Aaron was a hero according to what we learned, but he doesn't see.
Correct. Correct. Okay. No. So that's why I love this collection of midrashim, because they're really different reads on the emotional work that's going on. The first one is that we just read is the most radical, right? He's being rewarded, whether or not he experiences that way, whether or not he's convinced of it.
Well, he seems to have some ambivalency about his own intention.
That's right. That's right. Okay. So it could be, that's a really good point. I mean, it could be, let's say we only had that midrash, right? That's God's perspective. That's God's perspective. But he's the one who lived through that terrifying set of moments, and he had to make a choice. And how many times, he went back on that as his self-doubt, and you can't undo asiyat ha'egel, right? So how does he live with that? So in this midrashic tradition, the Sifra, and this is something that I really never appreciated until I was learning these midrashim, all the days of the Miluim, they're practicing. They're doing everything. They're wearing the right clothes. They're anointing. They're bathing. They're offering korbanot. But nothing has happened. Meaning there's no Shechina and there's no fire.
This is opening night.
This is, but this is 8th day, right? So there has been a whole week of all the Kohanim doing what they need to do. The people watching, and they're waiting. They're just waiting. So this moment is when Aharon turns to Moshe, right, according to this midrash, and says, we've done everything. We've done it all. And the Shekhinah's not here. I know why. It's because of me. Why'd you bring me in here? You brought me in here to embarrass me.
Doesn't it occur to the people to say why?
Wait, there's a second part of Rashi, okay? This is from Aaron's perspective. Okay, Hannah.
No, it's just interesting because he seems to recognize his own culpability, but then Moshe goes with him to address it. So it's not something that he has to do alone. It's Moshe, he's come with me.
Yeah, and that's that brother thing again, right? It's not as if, by the way, as we all know, that this can all be put on Aharon. Any which way. The Chet HaEgel is not only an Aharon problem. Moshe was not there, right? He's Moshe Ha'ish, and he does echo that back to him. So, but you hear, I love this, Hannah, because it's you get the pathos of this moment for the both of them, right? And also for Moshe, he's not going to be the Kohen. He's also abdicating a little bit or making space for Aharon in this, but nobody really knows. Nobody really knows how this is going to turn out. Okay, so at that moment, stop just from that part of the Midrash, they go back in together because Moshe's putting his arm around him. And then the Shekhinah comes down, but not yet the fire. Okay, take a look at the next one. Vayetzu vayivrachu et ha'am. Amru, v'hinoam Hashem Elokeinu aleinu. Yehi ratzon shetishre Shechina b'maaseh yedechem. L'fi shekol shivat yemei hamiluim sheha'emidu Moshe lamishkan v'shimesh bo uperku b'chol yom lo sharta bo Shechina. V'hayu Yisrael nichlamim v'omrim l'Moshe Moshe Rabbeinu kol hatorach shetarachnu shetishre Shechina b'neinu v'neda shenitkaper lanu avon ha'egel. And there's no end to that sentence. They're just saying we did all of this work. We're waiting to know that we've been atoned, and fill in the blank. It hasn't happened yet. Moshe, everyone blames him. Why'd you take us through this? Why'd you do this? They don't say, and we've been embarrassed, but that seems to be the implication. L'kach amar lahem zeh hadavar asher tzivah Hashem tasu ve'yera alechem kvod Hashem Aharon achi kedai v'chashuv mimeni she'al yedei korbanotah ve'avodato tishre shchina bachem ve'tedu shehamakom bachar bo. That's actually really interesting. I didn't think about this till right now. His answer to them deflects their own guilt and says, don't worry, Aaron's good for the job. He's going to help you get there. You might be looking at him as the one who got you to that other place. He's going to be the one who's going to take you to the other side. He's even better than me, he says. Kedai v'chashuv mimeni. And his korbanot and his avodah is going to bring the Shekhinah. It's very intense. I don't know if you read this part, but Aviva suggests a possibility that was going on for Nadav and Avihu is that they also were feeling the anxiety and that's why they rush in. And they're rushing in to try to bring the fire as opposed to waiting. And in her reading, waiting is part of what we need in spiritual life. Right? And so we know that, right? And that's her big thing. But it's so interesting that Nadav and Avihu in that reading, it has nothing to do with their own interests, nothing to do with their own avodah. They were on shpilkas about their father. And really, you think about it as a whole week of waiting and waiting.
Rehearsal. They kept thinking what happened that day. They didn't know that they had to wait till the 8th day.
I'm not sure about that. I don't know.
Sure.
I'm not sure either.
This could have been opening night and it was just delayed briefly, or it could have been delayed for 8 days.
Right. Go ahead.
But the waiting in and of itself also seems like a response to Chedai and that Chedai was like, we have to rush because he's not back yet. And this is like
Bidiyuk. That's exactly it. That's exactly it.
Well,
A
because
link is the impatience.
What's that?
A link is the impatience of the actors.
Right.
In both cases.
Correct. And Hannah's right that, part of having maybe Miluim, even if it wasn't supposed to happen in 7 days, only supposed to happen on the 8th, to develop that muscle of being able to be engaged in religious life. Here's the Dvar Torah at the end, right? For us to be engaged in religious life and to show up every day and to do what needs to be done and not expect that every day is going to bring that rush, right?
Tolerate the unknown.
To tolerate and the patience that spiritual kickback doesn't happen when we think it'll happen, doesn't happen at the pace that we think it will happen, but the game please God is long. Okay, we didn't get to the last one, but that's all right. I'll just tell you very quickly what I love about the last one is that it brings in the story of Nadav and Avihu very furtively, only through psukim, not through direct speech. What's that? Yeah, did I teach that at camp? Yeah. The last one, the Shitulim Beveit Hashem, and it helps us see that for Aharon, the story of Chet HaEgel and the story of Nadav and Avihu are the stories that kind of haunt him, right? And his unworthiness, and has God really chosen him? And that Midrash is again answering, yes, he's been chosen, and we could say even, not that this Midrash says it, but he's the very right person to be the facilitator of atonement, somebody whose flaws are visible, somebody whose tshuva is visible, somebody who we can relate to, who can help us, do the hakrava that we need.
Exactly.